Today, I have the distinct honor of introducing the retiring president of the U.S. Council on Foreign Relations, a position he has held for the last 20 years, Dr. Richard Haass. In the context of a dynamic global landscape and a complicated domestic environment, an informed and engaged citizenry has never been more important. Dr. Haass's new book, The Bill of Obligations, recognizes global threats like Russian aggression and a more capable China, both topics that we'll be covering in dedicated programs this summer, but identifies our largest threat right here at home. In fact, it's us. Again, please submit your questions at any time during the presentation, and I'll turn things over to Dr. Haass here in a moment. Our guest has served in the Pentagon, State Department, and the White House under 4 different presidents from each side of the aisle, and is the recipient of the Presidential Citizens Medal, the State Department's Distinguished Honor Award, and the Tipperary International Peace Award. He has authored or edited 15 books. Check out The World, A Brief Introduction if you haven't already. It is truly an honor to welcome to the Vail Symposium, Dr. Richard Haass.
Well, thank you, James. It's great to be with you, if only virtually. Happy to be kicking off your summer season since it's a glorious summer day here in New York. Just want to clarify one thing ever so slightly. I am not quite the retiring leader of the Council on Foreign Relations. I would say more the departing leader, since I have no plans to retire, just to do some different things starting this fall after 20 years here, which I've been extremely fortunate to do. What I thought I'd do is explain indirectly how I got to this book and why I think it matters so much, the issues in it. But let me just sketch out, if I may, the context. And I won't go on too long because I'd actually prefer to hear your questions. But let's just think about the current context, what's going on in the world. And let me basically highlight 4 things. The first, and James alluded to it, and when he talked about some of your future programming, is what you might call the return of history, the revival of geopolitics. We're obviously experiencing it most graphically, most brutally, most destructively in Europe, with this latest phase of the Russian war against Ukraine. It's basically 15 months since Russia invaded a second time. And what this war does is it represents many things, including a reminder that unlike what a lot of academics were saying and writing, war between countries is anything but obsolete. It is all too real. It also has highlighted, I believe, the continued relevance of what we used to call the West, and again do, of NATO, US relations with Europe, but also with countries such as Japan and South Korea and Australia, and so forth. So it's a reminder that 30 years after the end of the Cold War, the idea of a Europe that's whole and free and at peace, however long it lasted, it doesn't characterize the Europe of today. And then as well, there's the reality of the rise of Chinese power and questions about how China will potentially connect its power and its ambitions. Obviously, it corners or centers more than anything else on Taiwan. But again, it's another example of the return of geopolitics. We also see North Korea, the accumulation of a ever larger nuclear arsenal along with missiles to deliver it. We see Iran edging ever closer to the brink of having the prerequisites of a nuclear weapon or several nuclear weapons that could potentially be assembled in relatively small amounts of time. Excuse me. So what all this adds up to is again, the return of geopolitics. In no way are they simply things to study in the past, not simply history, but they are very much our present. Secondly, in addition to what you might call the geopolitical order and threats to it, is the global order. And again, and the challenges to that. We just out of, for the most part, one form of a threat to it, which was the pandemic, COVID-19. Upwards of 1 million Americans lost their lives. Most serious estimates, close to 20 million people lost their lives worldwide. And what it did was it highlighted not simply the destructive power of infectious disease, but in many ways the inadequacy of national and international arrangements meant to deal with it. But that is not unique to the realm of global public health. Obviously, it's true when it comes to the realm of climate change. And there it's even more pronounced, I would argue, the gap between the scale of the threat and the scale of the response. It's not just a future problem, it's increasingly a current one. I thought it was quite interesting the other day that State Farm announced it would no longer be issuing new homeowners insurance policies in California. And what I think this is a reflection of the gap between how we live and environment politically, economically, and so forth that we've gotten accustomed to, and the changing realities of climate change. And I would just say national and international responses are not keeping up. One of the most common phrases in this business is international community. But here and elsewhere, we actually see that there isn't an international community. There isn't a collective agreement on what needs to be done, much less the shared will on the doing of it. So there you have two, if you will, realities. One is the geopolitical order, which reflects a significant degree of disorder, and the global order, which likewise represents disorder and a gap between challenges and responses. Then thirdly, as if this were not enough, we face a reality, a present and a future increasingly defined by the emergence of new technologies. Like all technologies, there's positive sides and negative sides, the benign and the malign. And this is everything from the world of biotechnology to ever more capable computers to artificial intelligence, what have you. And I would again say, akin to what I said about global issues, there's a gap between the capacity of these technologies to potentially do harm and the ability and will of the world to rein them in. And indeed, I think this gap is large and getting larger by the day because technological innovation, in part fueled by the very technologies themselves, is outpacing any international regulatory ability to deal with them. So these are the three stark, if you will, realities of our time. Obviously, there's positive things that we could discuss in each one of these three domains. The response to Ukraine, for example, I think is an extraordinarily positive response, and how Ukraine and NATO and the United States have responded. I think it has girded international order in meaningful ways. At the global level, I see things, would say, in the mRNA vaccines and so forth, which were a fantastic accomplishment for helping us manage the challenge of COVID. And even AI, yes, there's potentially a dark side, but there's also incredible things AI will do for us. And we already see it in such areas as health. But I'm concerned in all three domains about the potential for growing disorder. What adds to it is the fourth area I want to talk about. This was a long, circuitous introduction. I apologize for getting to the subject of my book, which is what's going on here inside the United States. And if you think of everything I've mentioned, they add up to what I would call one side of the coin, essentially the external side of national security, traditionally the realm of foreign policy and defense policy. But there's a domestic side to national security, and that's the state of American society, American politics, our unity, our willingness and ability to agree on what the external challenges are, and then to devote the resources and execute the policies meant to meet them. And I would say that is increasingly suspect. It's not simply the fact that we don't have a consensus about foreign policy, but increasingly we're unable to come together in this country. And my own view of it is that American democracy has deteriorated for many reasons. Unlike Ukraine, the principal threats are not external, it's not invasion, it's internal. It's everything from the fact that we don't teach civics in our schools, so Americans often don't understand the basics of their own system and why it's valuable. The impact of social media, the fact that we've gone from an era of what you might call broadcasting to narrowcasting. We've had a government that over the last 20 years has not delivered in important ways economically or socially. So populism has become much stronger in this country. Parties have lost some of their hold, so it's become more, not less difficult to forge working majorities. But the fact is that American politics have entered an extraordinarily difficult phase. We're more divided, we're more polarized than any time in our modern history. And what I would say is that at the bottom of this is our focus, almost near exclusive focus on rights in the United States, and our loss of the sense of obligation. We've come a long way since John F. Kennedy could say, ask not what your country can do for you, what you can do for your country. A lot of that has been lost. And many of us as citizens are focusing almost exclusively on what we are owed, on our political, our social, our economic rights, and not nearly enough on our obligations, be it to one another or to our country. And before I introduce the idea of a coin with two sides of national security, the external and the internal, think of citizenship as a second coin with two sides. One side rights, one side obligations. And the reason that obligations are so important is that a democracy cannot succeed if it is only based on rights. Don't get me wrong, rights are obviously central to a democracy. They're in part what defines it. Abraham Lincoln famously described the unfinished work of America to narrow the gap between our principles and our practices. And that has been, in a sense, one way to understand the dynamics of American political history. But even if we were somehow able, magically, to finish Lincoln's unfinished work, it still would not be enough. And the reason is simply that rights inevitably collide. Take a mother or woman's right to choose versus the rights of the unborn. Someone's rights to bear arms pursuant to the Second Amendment versus the right to public safety. The right, some asserted, not to wear a mask or get vaccinated versus public health. So the question is, how do we navigate this situation? And how do we avoid either the rights so coming into conflict that they result in gridlock, where we can't meet our domestic or international challenges or responsibilities, or worse yet, deteriorating into violence. I admit my own views on this are colored. I spent 3 years as the US envoy in Northern Ireland, and I saw what could happen to a society that was deeply divided, and how political differences could degenerate at times into violence. On January 6th and at other moments, we've seen elements of that here in this country. So we ought not to be so sanguine that we say it can't happen here. The truth is, it did to some extent happen here, and it could happen here again in the future. So what I have tried to do here in this book is launch a national conversation. I don't pretend to have all the answers, but I want to have a national conversation about how to rebalance our approach to citizenship, and to get Americans to think not just about their rights, but also about their obligations, again, to one another, to this country. It could be everything from basics of citizenship, as Jefferson would say, to be an informed citizen, to be an involved citizen, to how we treat one another, questions of civility, openness to compromise, a rejection of politically inspired violence, or respect for norms, such practical things as making sure that civics is not only taught in our schools, high schools and colleges, but is required as a condition of graduation, that we build new avenues for public service, to give people the opportunity from different parts of America, different geographies, different levels of educational attainment, different wealth, different religions, different viewing habits on cable, to bring them together. to reintroduce Americans to one another, to remind Americans that this is a country based upon some common precepts, some common principles. And I think public service has the ability to do that. And if I were going to add up all the obligations I've written about, all 10 of them, the 10th and final obligation is the idea of putting country before person or party. The idea that no narrow political cause should come before that. I actually think we saw a positive demonstration of that this week. I don't want to make too much of it, but I think what just happened in the vote of the House of Representatives was a welcome development, both in demonstrating an openness to compromise, but also a willingness at time to put the welfare of the country first in avoiding default, even though I expect a lot of those on both sides of the aisle who voted for the agreement disagreed, but either with what was in it or was not. But that, again, is what we have to do in a democracy. The only problem is what happened the other day is too rare. And in no way do I assume, simply because we avoided default, that there's any willingness to tackle some of the basic questions on spending or taxation that have led us to the point where we've amassed a $31 trillion deficit, a debt rather, in the first place. So that is essentially what I wanted to do today, was to introduce this book, this how to rethink citizenship, to reimagine it. And then the question is, how do we encourage this? What is the responsibility of business leaders? What is the responsibility of parents, of educators, of religious leaders? Because this isn't just going to happen because someone's going to come into American politics and make it happen. It's only going to happen when citizens get more informed, get more involved, and commit themselves to embracing these obligations that would inform their political conduct. And I think it's essential because, again, democracy is hard. And it's, historically over the centuries, democracies have often had trouble in surviving. Again, less because of external invasion, and more because of internal erosion and corrosion. And a democracy that's broken is by definition unable to fix itself. It's unable to adapt. And if that's the case, it either can't deliver to its citizens. So increasingly, they're going to ask the question, what is democracy doing for me? I only see what democracy is doing to me. And if they reach that point, they are going to become much more open to alternatives, either pursuing their political goals through violence or embracing populist authoritarian solutions, which by definition would end our democracy as we've known it. So I think the stakes are high. This is not, by the way, a message of pessimism. It's a message of concern. I think the stakes are too important. The challenges are too real for anyone to be sanguine. But again, the purpose of my being here speaking with you today, of my writing the Bill of Obligations, is to light something of a fire, to trigger a conversation, and then to trigger political involvement, which I think could set the stage to make it more possible that we could meet our domestic challenges, and in turn, as a result, put us in a position to meet our international responsibilities as well. So James, why don't I stop there? That was my attempt to set the table, and I'm prepared to answer questions either about anything I've raised, or I'm prepared to go further afield if people would like to. You're on mute.
I am. The questions are coming in. Keep sending them, and we've got plenty to get us started. I wonder. I wonder if you're seeing bright spots at the moment. Are there maybe microcosm examples happening in the U.S. now that we can look to? Are there politicians or civil actors we can be really excited about? Where can those of us really seeking hope, where can we look to find some purchase?
So I'm going to be uncharacteristically optimistic and talk about some bright spots in no particular order. So I spent this afternoon talking to several hundred boys, I think junior, senior high school in Oklahoma, Boys State, and they spend a week basically on a retreat, learning about civic responsibility, patriotism, and so forth. I expect you have a Boys State, Colorado, what have you. And it was just, and all these adults volunteering, and these young men essentially volunteering to give up a week to do that. I thought that was, really good. New Jersey, a state next to mine, a few thousand miles from where you sit. Governor Murphy recently signed into law legislation that requires that New Jersey high school students study what's called information literacy. The idea is to teach them to better navigate the flood of information that defines modern life. How do they know the difference between a fact and something that's a misstatement? How do they, what are the best practices? We all talk about best practices for dealing with our computers. We don't write our passwords down on yellow stickums and make the password 1, 2, 3, 4. We learn not to click on everything that comes at us because it might be phishing. Okay, so what are best practices to make people critical consumers of information? For example, things like multi-sourcing and understanding the nature of what you're, ask questions like, is this edited? Understanding that the social media, think about it, social media, not serious media, not fact-based media, social media, which is fine for social things, but probably shouldn't be your go-to place for information. So what New Jersey is doing is really impressive. Take Stanford. Starting next winter, Stanford will require every freshman, I think there's 1,700 plus or minus, to take a module, I think it's 6 weeks or 2 months, in civics. That'll be a requirement for all Stanford freshmen, undergraduates there. Hopefully that will be modeled around the country by other universities. San Francisco, you recently had citizen involvement that removed several people from the school board for what they were doing. I thought it was welcome. You had Liz Cheney talk about putting country before party or person. She paid a large political price for it in her career. Whether you agree or disagree with her policies, it's hard not to admire her principles and are willing to live with them. Those secretaries of state in places like Arizona, Republican officials, who certified election results, even though it showed a Democrat winning. Well, again, that's their oath. The idea of putting country before party. What we've learned is you can't take it for granted. Or years back, you had groups like Mothers Against Drunk Driving. Those are perfect examples of citizen initiatives. And I could go on, but I think when de Tocqueville wrote Democracy in America, one of the things he wrote about is the tendency of Americans to come together, to work together, to deal with social challenges as they saw them. So I think there's lots of reasons, lots of things to point to see where citizen involvement is strong. And I mentioned a few minutes ago the debt ceiling vote. It's unfortunate that it ever came to that. I get it. And like I said, we've in no way even come close to dealing with the root causes of the debt. But the fact that at least for now, we didn't drive the bus off the cliff, that's a welcome development. I do think there are some grounds for, like this way, I'm not sure if it's grounds for optimism, but there's grounds not to despair. There's grounds not to give up. There's grounds to basically say, hey, we've seen some positive things happen, more positives can happen.
And narratives we can look to emulate in our own communities.
Sure.
Appreciate that. You set some high bars there, and then the bar got low when we were almost driving off the cliff. I'd like to pull a thread around misinformation, disinformation, truth, but I'd like to kind of back into it if you're willing. And I'd like to start with the education system. You mentioned, I think, high school boys. Let's think about our elementary, our middle schools, and our high schools. Maybe start there. We'll move into the university. You talked about Stanford, but I feel like the education system has made its way into the headlines quite a bit, and it's become a contentious issue. I wonder if you could, lensing through this notion of perhaps the next generation becoming the citizens we'd hope for, reflect a little bit on our current state of the education system in our country.
I think you have to break it down between, say, let's focus on high schools and college universities. I mean, I think there's also a place for middle schools and elementary schools. Groups like iCivics, created by Sandra Day O'Connor, are playing a helpful role there. we here at the Council on Foreign Relations have teamed with them, and we're teaching middle schoolers about the world. So there's things you can do at middle school. Let's focus on high school age and college, university. College, university, we'll focus on that first. Look, we've got over roughly 4,000 or so colleges and universities in the United States. The good news is that many are private. It's not a centralized system. It's not a state system. So what Stanford did, hundreds, if not thousands of other schools could choose to do. They could come up with their own best curriculum or way of teaching it. Stanford obviously has resources that most universities and colleges can only dream of. So I'm not saying they've necessarily got a model for everybody else, but I think there's things that any school can do. And my view, and a lot of schools offer civics, like, don't get me wrong, they just don't require it. And the distribution requirements are so, shall we say, generous or flexible that way too many students graduate college or university and not been exposed to what they should in order to become citizens. And we would never think of graduating someone from college who didn't have certain skills. Why is basic preparation for being an active citizen in democracy not a priority? I literally don't understand that. So schools could make the commitment to do it. Parents who are paying for schools should insist on it. It gets a little bit more complicated with public supported colleges, universities, because there you get into the content question. But even there, it's going to state by state. I think it's doable. High schools, again, you've got public schools, you've got religious schools, you've got charter schools, and you've got private schools. So for religious, charter, and private, it's easy because, again, they have tremendous autonomy. And I think they'll probably be the places where a lot of things will initially happen. More difficult in public schools simply because the politics of public education are fraught these days. Education has been politicized, even weaponized. I get it, but it's different in city to city, state to state, a local union to local union. So I think there's real possibilities still. I think civics has gotten shortchanged. Not so much because there was an anti-civics movement, but it's almost like musical chairs. We kept introducing other requirements, STEM and the like, and civics got squeezed out. When the music stopped, there wasn't a chair. There wasn't the resources, there wasn't the teachers, and so forth. So we can make it more of a priority. I'm going to spend time in my future looking at just that, working on teacher training, working on developing curricula that could be easily introduced into high schools and colleges. I've thought a lot about the content, and again, I have no illusions. In part, again, from my experience in Northern Ireland, it was very difficult. It was, Northern Ireland, just to give you an example of a divided society. We think we have problems, red versus blue. The phrase integrated education in Northern Ireland has nothing to do with color. It has everything to do with religious traditions. And less than 10% of the school kids in Northern Ireland go to integrated schools. They tend to go to single faith, single tradition schools, in part reflecting the neighborhoods, which are also highly segregated along religious lines. So I thought long and hard when I was involved there in trying to develop a curriculum that would help people deal with the legacy of the past, not try to impose or insist on a single interpretation, but make sure everybody understood the facts and was exposed to various interpretations to build a degree of understanding and so forth. I think we can do that here. Again, we'll have big debates, and people like me who try to do it will be criticized for what we include and what we exclude. I get it. And one of the advantages of not trying to do this nationally, but doing it at the state and local level, going back to Justice Brandeis's notion, is states are the laboratories of democracy. Okay. So just like New Jersey led the way on information literacy, other states can follow. Just like California is leading the way on public service initiatives. They've got several programs that they are piloting there. So various states can lead the way on civics education and see what works. And then others have the option of either adopting it or adopting a version of it. But what I want to do is get that ball rolling here.
I think we can speak for the audience when I say we'll be cheering you on as that ball starts to roll.
Thank you.
I want to ask a question about the role of history education. We've talked a little bit about civics, and just by way of example, contrasting Stanford moving in the direction of requiring civics We've been hearing about students on the campus of the University of Virginia wanting to disavow Thomas Jefferson, its creator. And not to conflate the woke issues there, but this notion of perhaps a gap in a healthy appreciation of US history and our founding fathers and the context in which they operated. I wonder if you could maybe reflect on history education as a core component of citizenship.
Well, history education is one of the central or critical elements of teaching about citizenship. We've got to expose people to the basic documents, yes, from the Articles of Confederation to the Constitution, Declaration, all these documents. Some of the things I did in the course of researching and writing this book, I read all the inaugural speeches, the farewell speeches, critical Supreme Court decisions. I mean, we've got, the literature, the de Tocquevilles, the Bryces, the Federalist Papers. We've got an incredibly rich political literature in this, because so part of it's to expose people to that. I want people understand the federal system, how we operate at the federal, state, and local level, and so forth, how we operate within the executive branch. I think citizens need to understand that. I think there's character elements of citizenship, which I get at in this book a little bit. But yeah, history is a part of it. And again, I don't think the goal can be to insist on a single strand of history, but we can say, look, certain things you can't argue. There are certain facts, certain events, and so forth. And then you can expose people to various interpretations of what led up to them or what the consequences were. And I think what you have to do is, there's an element still, though, of choice. I get it, about what to emphasize, what to include. Not all interpretations are equally relevant, or I think as defendable or defensible, or as serious. And so there'll be debates. Okay. But I think institutions have to go through a process. So I think it could be an inclusive process. Not everyone's going to like the results, but you go with it. And then you can be prepared to conceivably modify it after you teach it. But that's a fact. Look, I think core curricula are essential for schools. I think they've got to basically say, anyone who leaves this institution, high school or college, we can guarantee that this is what they have been taught, what they've been exposed to. Not everybody's going to like it. Great, go somewhere else. I don't think we can have a lowest common denominator approach to education. At some point, institutions have to stand for something. And if certain students don't want to attend the University of Virginia based on the preposterous premise that Thomas Jefferson should be eradicated from American history, then go somewhere else. But that's also, by the way, if students actually think that, talk about a failure. If you needed a demonstration of what happens if we're not serious about teaching our own history, about civics, I would suggest attitudes like that. And I don't mean just to pick on the woke left. I could say equally strong things on the right. My point is, we pay a price as a society if we're not serious about making sure that our basic traditions are taught. We've got to do that. American democracy depends on it. 30 more seconds. I apologize. What led me to this in part was my own religious background, being Jewish. And Jews gather once a year celebrate the holiday of Passover. And what's interesting about Passover, it's the story of the Exodus, the basic notion of Jewish identity, but you don't celebrate it in the synagogue. It's a holiday that is celebrated outside, because for much of their history, Jews didn't have access to holy places. They were persecuted, couldn't do things in big gatherings. So it's decentralized mobile Judaism. But what you do is you tell the story of the Exodus and of the holiday. And it's the way that you pass on the basic tenets of the religion, the basic identity from generation to generation. Well, that's what Americans need to do. We need to distill and pass on the basic tenets of Americanness, what this country was founded on. I'm not saying we've always lived up to it. Of course we haven't. But the point is, the goal of American political life ought to be to get closer to that, to, again, move along Lincoln's trajectory of unfinished work. And we just can't forget along the way that there's got to be an obligations dimension of this as well as rights.
So I want to keep kind of coming in and out of this concept of understanding truth and misinformation, disinformation, fake news. I want to kind of keep approaching it, but from different angles. And you just mentioned in the Jewish faith how those traditions, how that history, how those values are passed from generation to generation. I wonder if you could speak on how, from a citizenship perspective, parents, what the obligation is of parents to their children as the next generation.
I think a lot about it as a parent of two kids. Well, it's interesting. Ronald Reagan, in his, I could be wrong here, my memory serves me, I was in his farewell address, talked about the dinner table. And so that's one place parents can start. I don't know how, what the situation was when you grew up and so forth, but the dinner table turns out to be a pretty central part of a young person's learning. So that's one thing parents can do. And, even when I was a parent and I was working pretty hard and my wife was working pretty hard, but several nights a week, we made sure that we had dinner. There were even nights where I'd come home from the office when I was working in the government and then I'd go back. But it was important to have those, that hour or whatever it was, 45 minutes. So that's one thing. I think parents also should be involved in their students' education. It doesn't have to, we saw a form of involvement that was, I thought, unfortunate at times in the critical race theory. Some of what was said, and obviously the violence and so forth. But the idea of parental involvement and not control necessarily, but involvement, I think parents deserve a voice. I think Governor Youngkin, or then candidate Glenn Youngkin, made that point against Governor McAuliffe. So I think parents deserve a voice in the question of their children's education. And then again, other authorities have to make decisions, and parents have certain choices to make. So I think parents ought to be involved and ought to pay attention at every level. What's taught in the schools, and when they select a high school, if they have choice, or they select a college or university, then they ought to think about it, because different schools have very different curricula. They're very different schools have very different requirements. Some schools have no requirements. So you've got to decide what you want, and to basically stay on top of it. I think that's a big thing. At work, businesses, lots of parents work in businesses. Well, businesses have enormous obligations to democracy. Every business ought to make it easy for employees to go vote or work at a polling place on election day. That's something people can do. We can talk about more if you have other obligations of businesses for democracy. I have a whole list of them. Parents, we were talking before about Boy State. Parents can encourage their kids, whether it's to think about public service or to think about educational programs like Boy State or Boy Scouts or other things. A gap year. How do you spend a gap year? If you have a gap year, you can spend it, on the beaches of Italy if you're so inclined or so resourced. But you can also spend it doing public service, and there's things there. So there's, I think parents can do all sorts of things vis-a-vis their children directly, their own models of behavior, how parents act when they go to Little League. That can say something about civility or nonviolence. I would think. So there's those kinds of whether they vote. The idea when parents take their kids with them to vote, that's a powerful thing. And kids get to see what democratic participation is. So there's all sorts of things parents can do vis-a-vis their kids directly. There's all sorts of things parents can do in their communities, with schools. There's all sorts of things they can do through their businesses. So it turns out parents have a lot of potential impact.
For good and for bad. My kids are 7 and 11, and it's a persistent thought that I need to be mindful of the experience that they're having growing up. My job is to raise good humans, and that is an ever-present thought for me.
Something tells me you're doing okay at it.
Well, I appreciate it. You mentioned companies. We've got a few questions around the role of business and the role of CEOs, executive leadership
Sure.
teams. To what extent do the obligations arise in the cultural fabric of the business environment?
Well, very much so. Look, the Supreme Court said that businesses are citizens when it comes to freedom of speech. Okay, so be citizens. I mentioned one thing, make it easy for your people to vote or work at a polling place. A lot of companies are doing that. That's one thing. Universities give leaves of absence to professors to go work in government for up to 2 years. Why don't businesses do that? Might be hard for really small business if you have 3 employees, but what a big business is, why not? Let people go off, encourage them to go off, and tell them if they come back within 2 years, there'll be a job. May not be the same job, you may have to fill it, but there'll be something for them, if at all possible or whatever. I think that would be great. We want people to do that. I want businesses to not do things like contribute to, don't write checks to election deniers. How's that? Don't write checks to people who are calling for political violence, political candidates. Don't advertise on platforms that are giving these people voice. Businesses need to remember that they have an enormous dependence on democracy. They may not realize it. It's the analogy I draw is to oxygen, but businesses have an enormous stake that their workers can get to work safely and be safe at work. Businesses have an enormous stake that customers can go to stores. Well, how's that going to look in an America where there's violence? Businesses have an enormous stake in a government that can get things done and it's free and fair. So businesses, some of them just weighed in on the debt ceiling. Okay, that's a legitimate thing that they did. Well, look, think about it. If you're a business and suddenly the IRS is weaponized against you, how are you going to feel? So businesses have a stake in transparent and fair government, or regulatory agencies are turned against you. So businesses, it turns out, have an enormous stake in democracy. What I want them to do is act then on behalf of democracy, defend that stake. I'm not asking them to take policy positions. They shouldn't. I don't think businesses ought to be taking, I don't think General Motors ought to take a stand per se on this or that public policy issue. On whether we ought to be aiding Ukraine. That's not for General Motors to say. But General Motors ought to be doing things that support, not only to single them out, but they ought to be doing things that support American democracy.
Well, I think that gets us to an elephant in the discussion, a subsect of businesses. Can we talk a little bit about the media and the role of the press and the media? We've got several questions here that connect into the idea that their business interests is in magnifying the extremes, quieting the moderate perspectives on both sides or all sides of these conversations. And I think we can see clearly the economic incentives there. I think we can also see clearly the behavior that's resulting. I don't know that we'd have a lot of people feeling like that's great for democracy or good for our civil culture, but I wonder if you could reflect on the subgroup of business known as the media or the press.
Look, you put your finger on a real issue. Media is a business. There's a tiny amount of nonprofit media, but almost all of it is, and is for profit. And there's a tension between, you want to increase, if you will, consumption of your product. You want people to tune in, and often that means playing to certain passions or extremes and so forth. But no, the media has an obligation, I would say, to traffic in facts. I thought it was good that Fox lost, essentially, was the Dominion lawsuit. They still face another one because they were trafficking in what they knew to be misstatements. Now, look, all media, I understand, is going to be somewhat biased, both in what it covers and how it covers it. And that's one of the reasons that I think individuals ought to multi-source their media. So don't just read one newspaper. If you can, read two. Don't just watch one cable, read another. Certainly don't go to social media for information. So I think we need to understand that media will have biases, whether it's motivated by profit, personal preferences, might be blind spots, who knows? the preferences of workers, whatever set of reasons. Media has, so that's why, again, you've got to be aware of it. You got to protect yourself from it. And again, I think a competitive landscape is probably the answer. And we've got to set some limits. And I think what the court did in the suit against Fox was actually a healthy corrective.
This is going to ask you to speculate a little bit, but in an era where we're just seeing the beginning of the impact of AI and its ability to compellingly write with bogus sources, to create imagery, to create audio sources and videos, it's going to make the challenge of discerning truth even harder than it once was. I grew up when I could reference the Encyclopedia Britannica on the bookshelf and feel pretty good about what was in there. Any guidance or any help for those of us a little weary of navigating an AI future as it pertains to multi-sourcing and discerning truth or truthiness, maybe?
Look, Chat GPT and other such applications are relatively new. I worry about them, and I also worry about video forgeries, impersonations, and so forth, hallucinations, whatever you want to call them. So yeah, I think it's both text and image. It's an added threat to democracy because we'll have all sorts of misrepresentations that are going to be out there. So what can be done? One is I'm hoping that AI can also be used to counter AI. And I think there's some possibilities there. There's already, for example, for schools that are worried about students plagiarizing or using ChatGPT to do their essays, there'll be hopefully AI applications that will be very good at discerning that that's what's going on, at flagging that. So I think it's all technologies have multiple effects. And it's almost like the old thing in Mad Magazine, spy, counter spy. So there will be, we'll see how this plays out. And we may also need to add certain burdens to social media. I mean, the Supreme Court just the other day, once again, it essentially refused to hold the carriers, the people who own the pipes, in any way liable or responsible for most of the content. But we may, as AI develops, we may have to change that somewhat. We may say we now expect those who control the pipes to perform the following tasks before they allow something to go on, that they screen certain things with certain applications. So again, but I see it as an added risk to democracy. I'm not fighting your point. And I worry particularly about, for people, it's so good at the imaging and the voice copying. So I can imagine someone could have a 1-minute thing of this or that official, and suddenly you have to deny something you never said or did. And it's circulating on all this or that social media. So yeah, I think we're going to have to be really wary. It's going to be hard though. Let me just make a general point, and I think I made it before when I talked about new technologies. I'm worried about the pace of innovation. And I believe domestically, in terms of what we're just discussing here, James, regulatory frameworks, as well as internationally, I'm worried about the ability of the technology to outpace our ability to handle it. And I think that's a real concern. So I'm not going to sit here and give you a glib answer. I think it's yeah, but I also don't think we're going to be very good at banning, or I think the idea of 6-month pauses and the rest is just silliness. It's not going to happen. So we're not going to come up with these kind of gimmicky solutions. What we need to think about is very serious ways of countering the negative aspects of these technologies.
I agree, and I don't know that satiated the anxiety of the audience here about what's to come, but I don't think that was the point. I have a question that threads on that. You mentioned spy versus spy, so I feel like this might be safe to reference Spider-Man. But
I'm not a Spider-Man fan. I apologize, but go ahead.
The great with great power comes great responsibility quote that comes out of the Spider-Man universe. And as I was working through the book and contemplating how this thread has shown up in my own life, I kept coming back to the importance of a moral framework and a moral backbone, ethics and morality, that rights almost require a moral code behind them. And so when we think about the pace of innovation, part of what we fear there is misuse, intentional misuse. And I think that there may be a right and wrong in there somewhere. I wonder how you view, maybe it's a triangle, but the rights and obligations and this underlying notion of our individual sense of morality.
No, you're right. And one of the obligations in the book is about promote the common good. And we are our brother's keeper and our sister's keeper. We live in a society. We live in small communities, but we live in a society. So we have obligations, not just rights. It's one of the reasons that I believe religious authorities have a real role to play here. They ought to be preaching this. The old line about the preacher, he's there to comfort the afflicted. That's only half his job. The other half of the job is to afflict the comfortable. And preachers have to do that as well. So one of them is to remind people of their obligations, to look out for the welfare of their fellow citizens, to look out for the common good. We didn't do nearly enough of that during the pandemic. I would argue the openness to compromise, the civility, the avoidance of violence. These are all things that our religious authorities have a role to play. I mean, let me just make a larger point here, because we're coming to the end, close to the end, which is that American democracy is only going to, survive past our 250th anniversary and the like, is if a lot of Americans get involved here. We talked about parents, we talked about business leaders. There's a role for educators. There's a role for religious authorities. It's a decentralized response here. It's ground up. It's not going to be top down. It's not going to be someone wonderful waltzing into the Oval Office and solving it for us. And so that's essentially the message of what I'm trying to say, is we have to take on the obligations. We have to practice them in our lives. And there's a role for each of us to play. And there's a role for, in particular, journalists, business leaders, teachers, preachers, parents, what have you, to play. And that's the only way this is going to happen. And for those who don't accept those obligations, then it's up to the rest of us to use our voting power, other powers, to basically get organized, to do something about it. We want to reward the behaviors we want to see, and we want to push back against those that we see as threatening American democracy.
Hear, hear. There are so many questions. We could have this conversation for days. I know you have someplace to be. And what I would say is that not our explicit mission, but one of the things we think about a lot here at the Vail Symposium is enabling and inspiring more civil Thanksgiving dinner table discourse. So to all of you who didn't get your questions answered, please take it home with you. Take it to the dinner table and have some civil discourse with the people around you. I need to offer our sincere gratitude, Dr. Haass, for your time and your wisdom now, and thank you for spending this hour with us and for your service to our country. Ladies and gentlemen, Dr. Richard Haass.
Thank you, sir, and thank you for what you do as well. I appreciate it. Thanks for this opportunity.